Look, I was going to ask you because I think that in one of our conversations we talked a little bit about this, but I was curious. I got curious the other day. Um, you're in the process, in the initial steps of creating a story, of course, I don't want you to just leave on the table all your cards, all of the things that you use as a
Oh,
writer.
I'm an open book.
Uh, but but
I'll talk
but
about anything.
how do you go about it exactly? I mean, because of course I imagine that different writers, different artists have different methods, different processes they go through, different creative ways of building up their stories. But how do you do it exactly? I mean, perhaps not so much how you do it, but how much of it do you plan ahead? So you
I
have,
used to.
for example, you have an idea for a story before you start writing. Do you already have a detailed plan about the characters that you will have there, their personalities, their names, the places where the story will take place, the ending, or how do you go about it?
I used to not. First of all, what you're talking about is there are two kinds of writers. They say plotters and pantsers.
Yeah.
Plotters plot, right? And pantsers fly by the seat of their pants. I used to be a pantser, and because I felt like I don't know, I liked that feeling of kind of winging it and seeing where the story took me. And then I wrote an outline for one of my novels. And by outline, I didn't really write a classical outline. In fact, I didn't even start out trying to write an outline. I was just trying to think through. I knew I wanted to tell a certain story, and I was trying to think through how I would get from one part of the story to the next. And
Yeah.
so what I began doing was writing a chapter, giving the chapter a name. I didn't always give the chapter a name first. Sometimes I wrote a short summary of it first. I would just write a short summary basically of what I wanted to happen in that chapter. And
Okay.
so that's how I've settled on writing an outline. That to to put it more into a narrative, to put my outline into prose, into an actual functioning narrative works better for me than writing the sort of classical outline of, chapter one, A is going to happen. The protagonist meets the heroine. They go on a motorcycle ride. That doesn't work for me. It doesn't inspire me sufficiently to want to write to that directive, to that chapter. So, sometimes if I write a relatively short summary that's maybe just a paragraph, other times I even, if I feel moved, I'll write an entire scene from that, as it kind of comes to me. Not perfect, obviously, but just maybe a few lines of dialogue, whatever it is. And that has been really helpful to me. So now I think I'm an official plotter because I not only does that expedite the process tremendously, it just makes it so much easier to write. It also keeps somebody like me who is prone to creative tangents. It keeps me on the straight and narrow and
Yeah.
not, taking the reader to a place they don't need to go and they don't even really want to go, which is, kind of important. You have to keep your readers' needs in mind.
Yeah.
I think as a writer, I think that's important, not just your own needs. It's a conversation you're having in a sense with someone who is picking up your work, and you have to remember that it's not one-sided.
Yeah, I was curious about asking you about that. Of course, again, you're just one single creator. There are many different
Yeah.
ways of doing the same thing, I bet. So, but I was just thinking, so for example, we've already talked here on the show about, for example, a Game of Thrones. I've
Hmm.
mentioned a few times One Piece. And I mean, I was just, and The Lord of the Rings also, for example. I was just thinking about when writers try to go about creating those massive stories that go for more than 1,000 chapters in manga or several different 1,000 pages volumes, book volumes. I was just thinking, how much ahead do they plan their story? Because sometimes the story flows so well that one, as a reader, would think, oh, okay, so this guy, before he started his story, he must have had, I don't know, 1,000 pages of detailed plot lines or scenes that he would go through, and he must have had everything planned from the start. But then you get to, I don't know, the latest, or what will be the latest book by George R. R. Martin, The Winds of Winter, and he's been trying to write it since 2011, and he's just like stuck. Because, and then when that something like that happens, when the writer goes for 12 years without being able to finish the sixth book in the sixth installment in the series, you're like, oh, okay, so wait a minute, let's track back a little bit, because this guy hasn't planned that far ahead, because now he doesn't know what to do with so many plot lines and with so many different things happening at the same time in the story. And then, then sometimes readers read too much into something that came previously in the story, and
then they expect it to come back and become a major plot line, and it was never intended to be that.
And sometimes it's just, oh my God, this here 2 books ago was foreshadowing, and it's not foreshadowing at all. It was just that they coincidentally brought to the story something that, if you look back, it seems that 200 chapters ago there was foreshadowing for that, but it was not foreshadowing at all.
I'll tell you, when I look at someone like George R. R. Martin, I'm sure that Game of Thrones, the TV series, was both a blessing and a curse, because something like that, it really does interrupt your story process, and you don't want it to kind of absorb into your vision for the story, but it does. I think that the same is probably true for people who, for kind of established people with an established voice in their writing, if they attempt to use AI for something more than, say, an outline, because it begins to conflict with your own ideas, but it gives you ideas at the same time, but then you kind of lose sight of where you are. And I think that probably, I can't imagine that didn't have an effect on him, to watch them, in our opinion, badly finish up his series, right? And now there are all these expectations, and he's probably got to do, the double work of, I'm sure his work was interrupted by the series because he had to attend to that, but then to extract himself from the conclusions that the series writers made, and also allow there to be perhaps time enough for fans of the television series to get uninvested in the way that the series writers develop the characters and ended the story, so that they can invest in what Martin is writing. I can imagine that's a huge challenge. I mean, I know a lot of people are so mad at him for not having come out with this latest installment of Game of Thrones, but I completely understand it, and I think he's probably doing the right thing, taking his time about it, because unless he was just so in the zone and could finish it, despite the fact that he had this blockbuster series going on, which, I mean, unless you're a hermit of a writer, how can you not be affected by that? I think probably the more time he gives it, the more, hopefully, readers will be willing to reinvest in his vision for the story. I suspect he's going to end it quite differently than the way it ended, don't you?
I hope so. I really do hope so.
I really don't see it going any other way. Because, I mean, the way they ended it was just so mind-bogglingly television, for God's sake. You know, I mean, it was just so, I don't know, it was so amateur, I thought.
And you know what I like is when sometimes writers are really honest about how they do things and
Yeah.
how things work. Because I've watched a few months ago an interview with George R. Martin, and the interviewers were asking him, "Oh, so have you seen that that theory that was made by fans that's going around on the internet about this or that, or something that happened in the book? Does it have this or that meaning?" And he was
Yeah.
like, "Look, you can do with my story whatever you want. It doesn't bother me. But people sometimes read too much into your own work. It's not that complex. The only thing I had in mind there was this simple thing. It's not like connecting 1,000 different points in the story. It's nothing like that. It was as simple as this." And he also says that there are things, for example, about his characters, for example, the color of someone's eyes, or particular aspects of their personality, or particular things that he mentions in the main story but are not part of the main story. I mean, some of the background story to a Game of Thrones, for example, that he actually has to go and ask other experts on his own books because he doesn't remember anymore.
Oh, Ricardo, it's so true because, I mean, I write usually in series form, at least like a loose series of books. There might be a series of books that are in the same universe. And my kids are always kind of laughing at me because they'll see me like rereading my own books. And they're like, "Why are you reading your own book?" You know, like, because I don't remember what I wrote.
Yeah.
And I have to make sure that I have continuity. So I'm sitting there reading my own books, taking notes, going, "Oh my God, I completely forgot that I wrote that," because you do. You forget it the way you forget things in your own life.
Yeah.
And, a friend might be like, "Don't you remember when we did X, Y, and Z?" And you're like, "No, I don't remember that at all. When did that happen?" To them, it was obviously kind of a fairly important experience, at least enough for them to remember what happened. And you're looking at them like, I got nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but
It's incredibly detailed work writing a series, and unless the series is very simple, but there's just a lot going on. You're writing somebody's life,
yeah.
and sometimes the lives of multiple characters, and you can easily misremember what happened in your own story, the same way you can have a false memory about something in your own life and interpret a whole series of events differently because you remember it differently than other people who were experiencing it.
Yeah. But that's the thing, because there are people who are able to create such good stories, we sort of tend to idolize them and think of them as being people who died with, I don't know, 200 IQ and perfect memories and big planners, and and like they had the entire book in their head from the very beginning. But actually, I mean, I've never wrote a book, but I would imagine that perhaps most of the time you're actually rereading and rewriting things, right?
For sure. I'm doing something right now that I've never done before. I'm writing a Cold War detective noir series, but I'm going to finish the first, I'm going to call it a season. it may never have more than one season, but I'm kind of using television language for this because it seems appropriate for the way I'm structuring it. I want to finish the entire first season, which will be several books, not like super thick books. Like my Breath series is thick. It's, it's historical fantasy. So they're like, 450 pages, whatever each. These are barely not, they're novels, but they're detective noir. And so they're more in the style, well, obviously more in the style of, but also, it's more of what you would expect from, Dashiell Hammett and other noir writers. But what I'm going to be interested to find out is if I prefer writing the books one at a time, being able to sit on them for a while, think about it, then write the next book, or to essentially write it like, one big story, one big book. But all at once, basically, you know what I mean? All at once, write all these books at once. And, my intention is, I'm doing a little experiment here. My intention is to release them quickly and sequentially, because I'd like to see how that works. I'd like to see if it becomes more, if it becomes inspiring, motivating for a reader to just, go through the entire series at once this way with you, kind of in real time as they're being introduced and launched. I'm rereading this book right now, and I'm really just at the very beginning, but I'm enjoying the experience a lot. It's called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. I mean, it's like 30 years old. She was an ex-wife of Martin Scorsese, and she's kind of she's a writer too, but she also made a second career basically out of unlocking people's creativity.
Yeah.
Kind of this sort of motivational style teacher, but somehow this was a book I never ended up reading. Like I love books like Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg, but I'd never read The Artist's Way, and even though it's probably the most it's the kind of book that I would most relate to, because it does kind of take this spiritual approach to creativity, and that's something that's very much part of my personality makeup. But it kind of takes you through the process of sitting with a story and being in a place where you can eavesdrop on the characters, which a lot of it's easy to get out of that place and to put a lot of pressure on yourself and be like, oh my God, now I've got to write this. And I think that when you stop eavesdropping on your characters, you start putting kind of undue focus on maybe the setting, and you can write 3 pages of exposition just sort of describing where people are, and you don't need 3 pages of that. It's usually, not always, but you can really become tiresome for a reader if you're not in the zone, if that makes sense. If you're not in a place where you're able to listen.
Yeah.
And I think being in that place where you're able to listen makes it it makes it a lot more likely that you're also listening to the needs of the reader, not just to your own needs.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so I've started on this, and I'm trying to get up earlier in the morning and read it before I start work, rather than reading at night, which is my usual MO. Because I just get so tired at night that I really can't make it past a couple of pages anyway, and I just fall right asleep. But it's interesting, and it's also, I started reading it because I've started book coaching someone, a friend of mine who's wanted to write, who's a very good writer and a creative person, but who has never written a novel and wants to write a series, which the idea for her series is just terrific. So I'm really excited about it. It's been a lot of fun coaching her. And, you know, I've kind of book coached people in piecemeal throughout the years, but it's something that I've never really wanted to commit to. For one, because I had 3 kids at home, and you can only do so much.
Yeah.
But it sort of came at the right time because I'm trying to write this series, which is very different from the way I usually write. And so it's also forcing me to take my own advice and to follow that. So that's that.
Yeah.
I don't know where else to go with that, but God.
Okay, so let me put a pin on that book coaching thing because I want to get back to that. I don't know if today or next time. Let's see, because I have a particular interesting, let's say, thought experiment to ask you about that.
I love your thought experiments. We always talk about thought experiments when we get together. It's great.
Yeah, but let me ask you this. Are there times where you get a little bit frustrated about what you think are perhaps some of the limitations of your medium? That is, limitations of being a writer instead of being, for example, a mangaka or someone who creates comics or a film director, just because, for example, in those particular cases, they have visual aid to the story, right? I mean, are there times where you think, oh my God, if I was doing a movie instead of a book, or if I was doing a comic instead of a book, this would be so much easier to portray? Or I mean, I'm not trying to ask you here,
Yes.
of course.
Oh, no,
I'm not trying to imply that a book is better or worse than cinema or comics or whatever. It's just that perhaps you think that there are particular things, particular aspects that you think that perhaps are better done or portrayed in mediums where you have a visual aspect to them, for example.
I think that is, yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. You can almost see that at play in any medium. You can see where, on occasion at least, where the creator had to invent a device. Maybe it's a narrator, who in a film, who kind of talks over what's going on, because they simply weren't able to adequately tell the story without that. And for sure, there are times, because I'm a really visual person. I love film. I enjoy film as much as I enjoy reading a really juicy novel. So there are many times when I'm writing something and I really have to stop and think, because I'm trying to explain something that's very visual, and yet I don't want to do it in a way that bores or exhausts the reader. And I'm sure that that's the case for someone, creating manga or, comic books. It's not like, in most cases, you can have someone do a monologue that's this long. You know what I mean? You have to have very crisp dialogue. It's kind of like tweeting,
Actually, it's
very
also
concise.
But actually, it's also interesting because there are many different kinds of styles for comic books and manga, because there are some creators that, let's put it this way, they are very verbose. So sometimes you get almost walls of text and you are like, oh, come on. And then there are...
To me, then you lose the visual, and the whole point is the visual. It's the play between the words in the bubble, right?
But some of those creators are actually very good, and sometimes that sort of wall of text is needed or warranted. But there are others And again, I'm not saying that one way is better than the other. It's whatever you prefer. But there are others that they almost do not have any text at all. They are so good with telling you a story just through images that they just need one word here or there. Sometimes they even on a single page they occupy it with an image and then one single vertical word or something like that, and it's enough. So you know, it's amazing how the
It is.
many different ways there are for people to create great stories, I guess.
There are, and they're infinite, aren't they? And it just sort of depends on the way on the creator's approach and what their own skills are.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing when you read some books that are so dialogue heavy and yet they don't feel that way because you know, reading just a bunch of dialogue without any descriptors, you know, without anything in between that tells you where they are or, you know, how a little movement that a character might have made that lets you know what exactly they're trying to say, even though, you know, they might be talking about the weather, but really they're talking about something else underneath. And you know that just because of, you know, a look they give someone.
You know
And
what? You
it's
know,
incredible to be able to do that without that, you know, without those descriptors, you know,
yeah.
and just to do it through dialogue. And then on the other hand, you have other people who will have almost no dialogue at all, which can also be dreary,
Yeah.
and yet are able to communicate a scene, a party, a cocktail party where everybody's talking, you know, without hardly a single word of dialogue, and yet it's incredible, you know.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two different examples. So first of all, I'm a sucker for a good dialogue
Me
story.
too. Me too.
I love dialogues. I mean, even in movies, one of the criteria that I use to classify a movie as good is it has good dialogue. Okay, so for
Yeah,
me, it's
for sure.
almost half of what makes a
Bad
movie.
dialogue makes me want to throw Rotten
Yeah,
Tomatoes.
but okay, there's a movie. I don't know if you ever watched it. My Dinner with Andre.
Oh, yes. Oh my God.
Um, uh,
It's incredible.
Look, there's the visual aid there for sure because it's a movie, but still, it's one of my favorite movies, and
I
it's
love it.
just it's as simple as you can get. It's like two guys having
It's two
dinner.
guys having dinner and
It's two
having a
guys
long conversation.
and having an effing long conversation
Yeah.
about everything, anything and everything. And I really love that movie. And then on the other side, there's a Portuguese writer from the 19th century called Essa de Queiroz, and his magnum opus, or at least the book that people consider his magnum opus, it's even mandatory reading here in Portuguese schools, is the Maias. In English, in Portuguese, is Os Maias, but anyway, and he was a realist writer. I mean, realism from the 19th
Right.
century, where many times some of those writers were really heavy when it comes to description. I mean, scene
Mhm.
description and describing places and all of that. And I mean, I love the story, but I have to be honest. Whenever it gets to the descriptions, I have to skip them because it's just too much. I mean, he describes every single object in the room, and I'm like, oh, come on, man.
Well, yeah, you have to. I feel at least. Yeah, I mean, I guess you don't have to, but I feel like you want to leave something to the imagination of the reader for them to fill in. You know, you want to sketch it for sure, and you want to give them a little color here and there, but it, it, that makes it the reader's own too.
Yeah.
That's how, you know, readers feel a sense of investment in a story,
And look
is that they get
about
to, use their imaginations too.
And about the descriptions, I don't know if you agree with me on this or not, but the descriptions I like the most are the ones where you are describing relevant things to the story. So I don't know, let's think about the concept of a Chekhov's gun. Okay, so you're
Yeah.
describing the gun, but the gun
The
is
gun gets
important.
used.
The gun
Yeah,
gets used,
exactly.
but just describing, oh, the chairs, the tables are this or that way, and then it doesn't matter at all to the plot because you're not going to use the chair or the table or the calice or wherever or the chandelier or whatever. I mean, it's just too much for me if you're describing
Yeah.
things that do not. I mean, I understand that descriptions might also not be useful for the plot itself. It's just describing a beautiful scenery or a beautiful house. Or I understand that people might like that, but for me, it's just I don't know. It breaks the pace of the story. You know.
I don't like excessive description, and I think I've committed that sin as a writer, by the way. And I, often, I'll just speak for myself. It, that that needs to be taken out, I think, during the editorial process, because I think sometimes when you're writing a story and you're listening in on that story, um, you're building the environment in your own mind.
Yeah.
If you haven't, if you're not the kind of person who builds it excessively on the front end, which I don't do. I feel like I find that inhibiting, and then you're always, at least I am, not you, but then I'm always checking to see, oh, what was it that I said needs to be in that? Oh, well, I guess I should write that in. And that interrupts my flow. But for sure, then what you're faced with sometimes, most of the time, is that at least in some parts of your story you've over described, because you get into a room and you're like, well, what is this room? And then you describe it, and sometimes you might even describe it really, really well, and you've got to make the decision then and not be vain about it, for heaven's sake, and say, okay, that's a great paragraph, but it's got to go, or it's got to be cut by 2/3, because who cares?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's inhibiting, and it's clunky.
And
You're not enhancing the experience of the reader.
and look again, people who like that kind of thing,
Some do,
perfectly
yeah,
perfectly fine.
yeah,
I'm not bothered by that at all. But I myself, I'm a character and plot guy.
yeah,
Characters
yeah.
and plots are the two most important things for me. I mean, you can even be extremely bad at describing places, and it doesn't matter much to me as long as the characters are well developed and the plot is interesting. So
I agree. I love character-driven stories. They're my favorite. I like a good plot. I want there to be a plot with the characters, but those are the two most important things to me. And I think that, like some readers, the sort of, um, you know, the Dan Brown stories, for instance, those are great. They're plot. They're plot, 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 plot. Um, they're for people who love puzzles.
yeah,
And a lot of mysteries are that way. You know exactly how, not exactly how they're going to end. You may not know exactly who did it, but you know the procedure through the story, and it really is like playing a game, a board game, or doing some kind of word puzzle, crossword puzzle, or whatnot. And I like a little more than that. It's kind of why I like mystery writers like. Well, I feel like P.D. James does a really great job, that she creates a world, and it's not just a puzzle.
Oh no! Look,
And
I definitely
yeah,
think that crime stories are some of the best ones out there to explore
yeah.
human psychology, for sure.
For sure. And that's why I love to read. I like to explore human psychology. I like to be the person sitting there, watching people go by. I like watching my own behavior. Um,
Yeah.
in as and I like to be as detached about it as possible and, understand my own motives in a kind of clear-eyed way. And I like to do that with others. Um, I, I just find that to be really, really interesting. And
But the Dan Brown books, look, I know that perhaps I will be crucified by some intellectual people, but I actually like Dan Brown
I do
books.
too. No, no, no. That wasn't a criticism of Dan Brown.
No, no, no.
I think his books are
I
terrific.
wasn't
I'm
saying
saying
that
it's a
you
certain
were.
style of
Yeah,
writing that's plot focused and hugely addictive
yeah,
because it's a puzzle.
yeah,
And it's primarily a puzzle. It's not that his characters aren't interesting, but that's not the focus of the book.
yeah,
Um, what is it? The character is in Robert Langdon, I think, the professor. Really
yeah.
interesting concept for a character, but the character doesn't get developed in any massive, or deep way. It's about the puzzle, and you know,
But by the way, since you touched there on character development, I also wanted to ask you this. So, because people, I mean, at least the more critical kind of people, they tend to talk a lot about developing and liking multi-layered
mhm,
characters. There is characters that are not just one-dimensional, that
right.
are psychologically complex. And I mean, but what does that mean exactly? Because sometimes, so just to I mean, run through a sort of abstract example, but sometimes people complain about characters being one dimensional. But
Mhm,
then, on the other hand, sometimes people also complain about characters breaking character. And
right.
sometimes it seems a bit weird to me because not always, but some of those times, what people are referring to is, oh, so this character did something in this particular situation or behaved toward another character in a way that doesn't go along with the kind of expectations you have for him. But isn't it a bit weird because we ourselves in our, let's say, real lives, we don't behave the same way with everyone, right? I mean, I mean,
Yeah.
we behave differently depending on the person we are interacting with and the kind of relationship we have with them, right? So what I'm trying to say is, oh, I don't know. Let's say that someone, um, I know. Let's say that you're talking about Tony Soprano, and
Mhm,
he's a criminal, and he's a very tough guy, or I mean, apparently tough
yeah.
guy, and then suddenly he's a guy who can't really hurt children and animals and all of that. I mean, people perhaps sometimes people are expecting for a criminal to be a psychopath and to be bad to everyone around him, but that doesn't need to be the case necessarily.
No, they can act in, what can be viewed as a psychopathic manner under very certain circumstances. I
Yeah,
think um, terrorists are a great example
yeah,
who might themselves have, completely normal family lives if you went home and have a wife and children or whatever it is. Um, and then under a very particular circumstance, they're capable of doing horrendous things.
Yeah.
Um,
But I guess
Certainly,
that,
like with war, that's something
yeah.
that happens a lot more common under really intense circumstances like that. It's something that a soldier has to contend with. It's something
Yeah.
that someone who is in an occupied land or is an aggressor has to contend with. All of this, even if they think that they have every right to be doing what they're doing.
But now that I've described that to you, that sort of I don't know, contradictory or conflicting view that people have of characters,
Yeah,
where they expect them to be one thing, but at the same time they want them to be multi-layered and so
yeah,
complex. I mean, now that I've described that to you, it came to my mind that perhaps the way people react to or think about characters is the same way we think about real people, because we
yeah.
expect people to be, let's say, a good person or a bad person every time toward everyone in every situation, but sometimes people are just different people in different situations. They behave differently toward different kinds of people, and sometimes people are behaving unexpected ways as well. Right.
It's true. Human beings are predictable only for for short spurts. You might be able to predict if you know what I'm saying. You might be able to predict the way a conversation will go in the first few minutes because you're exchanging pleasantries.
Yeah.
Not always, but sometimes a conversation starts off and it starts off in a completely different place than you never expected. But you can pretty much predict when you run into someone on the street that you haven't seen in a while that, oh, nice to see you, Ricardo. How are you? I'm doing well. Can you believe this weather? No, I can't. Sure is hot for this time of year. You can predict it until a certain point. And then you have no idea if you actually sit down with this person and you don't, go your separate ways. You have no idea really where that conversation is going to go. But I think when two things happen when someone says, oh, I didn't like that because that character wouldn't do that. Either it's because the writer failed. They did not, at least at that point, have the skill to help take you on that character's journey and show you how the character, kind of build the ladder rungs between this behavior over here and then this seemingly out of character behavior over here. It could be because of the reader's expectation that, hey, I wanted a happy ending. I thought those two were going to end up together. You know what I mean? Or whatever. And their expectation kind of superseded maybe what was organic to the story, in their own mind at least. And so they could not accept the story that the writer actually wrote because they wanted, this is what I wanted. I mean, I think you and I have talked about certain genres, like the romance genre, for instance, that a book is not a romance unless it has a happy ending.
Yeah.
Then it's not a romance. Then it's a love story. If it has a different ending other than, and they lived happily ever after, or they lived happily ever after for now. You know what I mean? And so, a writer has to be very careful, depending on the genre that they're writing in, because if you are writing a piece that is pretty strictly adhering to genre, you're setting up very specific expectations for the reader. And if you deny the reader what they're expecting, you'll be punished for it. Now, if the reader is expecting something that's genre bending from the get-go, they'll usually go on that journey with you if they like your writing, assuming that they actually like what you have to say. And they'll enjoy being taken on that journey, and they'll say, oh my gosh, can you believe that this happened? But a lot of it depends on expectation. And I think also, I think a writer or creator has to be careful not to um, not to make a character do something or create a situation just for the sake of creating it because they want to do something different or because they want to make a political point. You know, it's or a personal point. You know, it that's kind of where the artistry comes from, is understanding what is outside of what you're creating, what is organic to the story that you've set up and you've perhaps, you know, written the bones of. But the fact is, there's something else going on besides um, besides your, you know, your expectations, your original expectations for the story. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've started to write something and I've even had it, you know, plotted out and everything. And then I realize at some point in the story that something has to change because I start to recognize, and this can be really painful, by the way, because it can undo a lot of work you've already done, or it can just hurt because you're realizing that something really painful has to happen in the story, and writing that is painful.
Yeah.
You know, if you have to kill a character, for instance, that you've become really attached to, and you're realizing, oh my God, this person can't survive this. I didn't realize that when I was writing it. You know, I thought this person was going to survive. I thought this person was going to go on and do, you know, the things that I had prescribed for them. But I'm realizing right now that they're about to get it in the neck.
Yeah. No, about the expectations, so several ideas. So one of them is you really get to have direct contact with how different expectations make people love or hate stories when there's an ongoing story and you
Yeah.
go, for example, to online forums and people are trying to imagine what will happen next in the story, and then there are people that say, oh, the X should happen, and then there are people that say Y should happen, and there are people that say, oh, wherever,
Yeah.
let's see what happens and then we'll see if it's good or not. And when for example, people who got it right usually like the story, people who got it wrong usually
Usually don't
criticize.
like this part.
Yeah, and then the ones that were just open to see where things would go. I mean, most of the time, if they already like the story, they keep liking it. Sometimes it's just, oh, this was a bit silly. And then also, you mentioned politics at a certain point there, and I was thinking like, even politics sometimes, even if a book is heavily political, sometimes it works.
It
So
does. You're absolutely right.
just think about Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
I
I mean,
know.
I mean, for me, that book is awful, but libertarians, they love the
They
book.
love it.
It's like the best book ever for
Milan
libertarians.
Kundera's books are, I think, beautiful, and I think he was absolutely robbed of the Nobel in literature, but they're highly political. You
Yeah.
know, I don't think it's ever. I think that the story is at the forefront, and the story is so compelling, um, which is what makes it so good, you know, even though he has a very clear political point of view. I mean, it's kind of impossible to miss. But and with it's interesting because with Ayn Rand, it's just the opposite. Her politics are fascinating. You know what I mean? And you know, her characters aren't that great. The story's interesting. I think the plots are pretty interesting, but the characters aren't that great. But she is such a force. She is so interesting that, like you said, particularly libertarians, particularly if you are, um, you know, highly susceptible to that point of view, it's riveting for you. The way, you know, happily ever after is the only acceptable outcome for someone who is a true lover of romance.
Yeah, and
You
the same for people on the left. I don't know if you know Bertolt Brecht, or a writer from the, I think, the late 19th century. And I mean, his
I do, but
book,
I haven't read. I mean,
yeah,
I
his
know that, yeah,
books,
you're right. Yeah,
his books are like a cheesecake for leftists.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
just it's just like bashing the powerful, uplifting the
Yeah,
downtrodden.
yeah,
And I mean, the books are, objectively speaking, not that great, but for
yeah.
someone who is
But
on
they're
the left,
delicious for someone who wants to experience that, right?
yeah, yeah.
Vicariously. So true.
And then, just going back to the characters for a second, also there are particular kinds of stories or fiction where sort of one-dimensional characters work pretty well and work best. So, for example, Mr. Bean, the comedy series.
Yeah,
I mean, Mr. Bean is the simplest character you can create. The thing there is about creating funny situations. It's not really about the character being extremely complex. He's a very simple character, but it's a great comedy series, right?
no, it's true, and that's kind of well, that goes back to whatever the particular strengths of the writer are, because there are people who are incredibly good at creating circumstances that force the characters to react to the circumstances, and then others do the inverse, where where the characters influence the circumstances, and all you want to do is follow that character around and watch them influence their environment, watch other people react to them, other characters react to them, watch how an organization might change by the addition of this person.
Yeah.
Or God, what is it? There's a great what is it called? Oh God, I'm not going to bore you with it then, because if I can't recall it, I'm not going to sit here going, now what was that? But the story was basically about a bureaucrat who likes things to be the absolute same all the time. It's an old Thurber story, James Thurber, I believe. And a woman is hired into this company to make changes as his boss. And that is very bad for this guy. He does not like change. And so he goes about orchestrating her demise. I mean,
Yeah.
not her literal demise, but her demise in the company. And it's just so funny.
Oh my God.
And
Let me
that's the
just,
only story that I can think of where those two things play together in this sort of like Escher-like way.
no, let me just say, and you're probably going to laugh at this, but when you described the character as being a guy who wanted for things to be always the same way, this is for you to try to see, to have a glimpse at how my mind works. What came to my mind, someone who likes to have control over everything around them, and then the two stories that came to my mind, Citizen Kane and
Yeah.
50 Shades of Grey.
Oh my God. Two stories that couldn't possibly be more different, right?
But this is just for you to see how my mind works.
I think that's a good line.
Oh my God, this would probably make for a good stand-up plot.
So I was thinking about Citizen Kane, and 50 Shades of Grey came to mind.
Yeah, Rosebud has everything to do with BDSM for sure.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Oh my
You
God.
know, I hope I haven't mentioned this on one of our conversations, because I think we did talk about 50 Shades of Grey at one point, but I thought the most interesting thing about the 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon came out of the prison system.
Oh, really?
Yes. I read this. This was back when, like, this was back when 50 Shades of Grey was kind of first out, and it was first a huge phenomenon, and everybody was reading it. And the article that I was reading, the writer focused on the fact that in men's prisons, it was number one what men were reading in prisons, and in women's prisons, it didn't even crack the top 10, maybe not even the top 20, which is sort of the opposite of what was happening outside of prison, right? And as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, that makes sense, because those women are in prison probably because they killed a son of a bitch just like this guy. You know what I mean? They're used to being treated that way, and they don't glamorize it, you know?
Yeah.
And they're like, you know what? When I look at Christian Grey, I think Mark or whatever, you know? But I just thought that was so interesting that, you know, women in prison weren't reading it, that they weren't interested in it.
But you know, maybe
in men's prisons, the men were definitely reading 50 Shades of Grey. I thought that was so
you
funny.
know, maybe the minority of prison women or prisoners, female prisoners that were reading 50 Shades of Grey were the ones those kinds of people where they like to get angry at the story. Oh, come on, I will keep reading or watching this because this is making me angry.
It's true. And it's funny because there's this one review that went, you know, viral on Goodreads of 50 Shades of Grey that was so funny. I mean, it was like crying funny, laugh out loud funny. And she was a hater. You know, she and her brother were reading it out loud to each other, hating on it. And you know, haters can just be so funny though sometimes. So it was really, really good. You know, speaking of haters, when we were talking about stories that go kind of, that perhaps betray readers' expectations or defy readers' expectations, I was thinking about the Star Wars universe. And I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan. I am not well versed in this. I saw the first three, you know, the ones that came out in the 70s, and I loved them as a kid, but I have not followed the series since then. But what has been interesting to me is how angry Star Wars fans are at Disney for how they, you know, apparently took the story sideways and did not give readers what they were, or watchers, what they were hoping for. And
it's also funny because if you go on the internet, sometimes there's ongoing wars between different fandoms, and then people vote on what's the most toxic fandom out there. It's like, oh my God, the Harry Potter fans versus the Lord of the Rings fans, and the Star Wars fans versus the Star Trek fans, and the other sci-fi universes, and then it's George R.R. Martin versus Tolkien versus whoever, and
it's so true.
Yeah. So let me ask you another kind of question that I think it's something that even over. This is our fifth or sixth conversation. I lost count by now.
I lost count too. But all I know is that I now need glasses to see you clearly. Well, not when I sit back, and I didn't when we first started. How's that?
Well, I also have some white hairs on my beard now, and 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, they're a little blurry to me, so I don't see them. I just see a nice lush dark.
Yeah, probably on camera it's hard to see them, but it's very easy to notice them in person. Anyway, are there any things when you're writing a story that you just think to yourself, okay, so I would never go there? There is, for example, describing the very tiniest details of a crime, or I don't know, exploring topics that you think are too immoral to explore in a story, or perhaps creating characters that have specific ideas that you think are too immoral? I mean, do you set any moral limits to what you would explore in a story or not?
Not that I know of, because I think that it's about, how that is done. I mean, I can't imagine ever writing something that genuinely glorifies something grotesque and doing it in a way that is, obviously an endorsement. Let's put it that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Fall allergies are upon me, but I can't think of anything that I absolutely wouldn't address. I always thought that I couldn't address a child being hurt, especially being a mother. That's really difficult. I mean, it is really, really difficult. It's, in the same way that it's also hard for me, like, to watch a dog being hurt, an animal being hurt in that way. But I did address it in a book, and that kind of surprised me. And I did it because I realized that I'd set up the story in such a way that I had to address it. I couldn't leave it. I didn't get into, I didn't make a meal of it. And not that maybe that, I'm not saying that it would be bad to do that in all circumstances, but that's just not something that I wanted to do at all. But I realized that I did have to address it because it was a war situation, and a child was excuse me, I'm sorry, and a child was killed, and it was in a pretty awful way and by a pretty awful person. Yeah. But I felt like I was shirking a responsibility to the reader if I didn't address that.
Yeah.
The reader was invested in the story, was invested in the child, and also it was necessary for the development of another character for that to happen to them, and for I had to create a circumstance that was awful enough that it would propel the story to where it needed to go, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and not for any moral reason, I don't think it's necessarily immoral to depict, a child being hurt or killed. I think that it depends entirely upon context. Yeah. But I never thought that I would write it because I thought it would just be too difficult. And it was very difficult to write for me. I avoided it for days because I knew I had to write that scene, and I'll do some admin today. Well, I have to write, I'll write an essay on family lore, whatever it is. I really avoided it in a pretty egregious way for several days until I finally sat down and said, this is ridiculous. This has to get written, and I'm going to do it. And it was such a relief to get it done. Okay, it's hard. I mean, it's very hard to write about certain topics and scenes. I mean, it is really hard.
Okay, so let me ask you then another question related to that. Have you ever read or watched something fictional, of course, where you thought, okay, so the author here went too far. I mean, this is just too graphic, too detailed, too violent. Have you has anything like that ever happened to you?
No. Not in something I've read, but there is, this is a long time ago, there is a book that I read, which was a sequel. It was the sequel to, it was the book Hannibal. It was the sequel to Silence of the Lambs. Mm-hmm. But the book version, where I read it and I thought, what the hell is this? Do you know what I mean? so, I really felt like the author had gone off the rails and was writing like a weird fantasy of theirs and not what was this, not the story that he had originally written. Look, it's his story. So just by definition, I'm wrong, right? But as a reader, I felt like he did not, I felt like he'd gone off the rails, and not in a grotesque sort of way, not like, oh, I don't want to read that, but in a what the hell kind of way. But no, I've never read anything that I can remember that that I couldn't get through. I think often if you are absorbed enough in a story, well, one of two things can happen. You might love a character so much that you're like, oh my God, I know they're going to die and I can't read that. And you skip ahead a few pages, you know what happened, you accept it, but you just can't go there. I understand that. But usually in what I'm reading, when I'm absorbed enough in a story, I can take it and I can understand why the author put it there in the first place and why I have to be taken through that in order to, get to the other side, the other part of the story, kind of like what I described with what I felt like I had to, when I had to put in, a difficult scene about a child being killed. I put it there because I really didn't see any other way for the story to evolve, for the story to get to the place that it needed to be. And usually when I'm reading something, I feel that as well. That doesn't mean that there aren't parts of stories that I haven't read where I've winced. I mean, really, what comes to mind that was so difficult to face was Styron's Sophie's Choice. I don't know if you've read Sophie's Choice or if you've seen the movie.
No, that one particularly, I don't think so, no.
But the story is about a woman named Sophie who ends up during World War II in a concentration camp. And she has two children, and they make her choose which one is going to be killed. Hence the title. I think they both end up being killed. But, they both end up being killed. But they make her choose, which is, for a mother, that is like, it is so horrific to imagine yourself in that situation that you want to look away because it's like, and I don't even know. It would be hard for me to imagine a woman being able to write it, not because she wouldn't have the skill, but you would almost need the detachment of a man to write that. Not that a man is detached from his children. That's not what I mean. But it is just, I can tell you as a parent, it's so like, it's a whole body experience. I can still physically conjure the feeling that I would get when my child was hungry.
Yeah.
And again, I certainly think a woman could write that. I'm not saying that she couldn't, but Styron just did it so brilliantly, and it was fascinating and tragic and horrifying and beautiful.
Okay, so let me try to put it another way, and then perhaps I can give a few examples of mine. Are there any stories in books, movies, or any other kind of medium that you've read, watched, and after the fact, you thought to yourself, okay, so even if this is a great story, because of the way things are depicted, I don't feel at ease recommending it to other people. Have you ever had something like that, or?
I've I'm not sure I'd put it quite that way. Like, I mean, there's certainly stories where I disagreed with the premise,
Okay.
maybe with their historical premise or with a moral ambiguity that that the story depicted. You know, I definitely, but I would never. I don't think that I would ever go so far as to say, well, don't read that because of it. Where I wouldn't recommend it, I'd say, well, it's interesting, but here's what I think. You know, I so I guess I don't. My answer is I don't think so. I can't conjure something. You know, a memory of a time when I've read something and said, I'm so offended by this. I think it shouldn't be, or I would discourage people from reading it.
Yeah,
Although I've told people when something really sucked, you know, definitely. Like,
yeah,
oh, God,
but
that's
that's a different kind of thing. But
it is. It's very
I wasn't thinking perhaps so much as being offended, but perhaps more as, okay, so perhaps the guy here, the creator, went too far in terms of
graphic.
the things graphically, and I mean, I don't think I would feel well recommending I was able to go through it. I still think it's a good story, but I wouldn't feel well recommending this to anyone, because even if the story is good, I don't think that people would be particularly enriched by being exposed to it. Something like that.
I can't come up with an example of that. I mean, if I felt that, I don't remember the
Okay,
story. And
so
I think I would probably if I felt so strongly about something. I don't think so. Have you? Like, is there a story that you've read where you're like, whoa, he or she should not have gone there. That was too much.
okay, so I'm going to explain to you what happened here over the course of my life, basically. So
Mhm.
probably until 10 years ago, I was one of those people that was like, okay, so you should be exposed to great art of any kind,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter if it makes you feel unwell, if it makes you feel a little bit sick, even if it's good art, you should be exposed to it. But then, for example, I watched The Antichrist by Lars von Trier. I don't know if you ever watched that one. And I was like, I mean, it was very hard to go through it, particularly the last 20 minutes or something like that. But I went through it, and I mean, I've never had myself, I was never exposed to any story where I was like, okay, so I have to stop here. I can't go further. I can't take it anymore. That never happened to me personally. But then I tried to watch it together with a couple of friends from university back then, and one of them accidentally skipped the movie to one of the most violent scenes, and they were like, "Man,
Well, I can't do this.
I can't watch it. Sorry, look, this is just too much." And then the same thing happened when I tried to show, for example, my mother a couple of movies that, for this or that reason, she doesn't like I mean, to see certain kinds of things, and then, I mean, over time, I got to a point where I sort of became more sensitive to the idea that perhaps there are certain kinds of graphic things, perhaps not so much in books, but in movies, because you actually see the stuff that's happening there. Where I mean, there are certain things that I really hesitate to recommend to other people, because one thing that I think about now that I didn't consider before 10 years ago or so is, okay, so this is a good story, but is it really worth it for someone to be exposed to it? I mean, if someone is not and never watches this, would they be missing on something? You know, and now I think like that, and for example, The Antichrist is one of those movies. The adaptation of 120 Days of Sodom by Pier Paolo Pasolini is another one of those movies because of the sexual
Yeah,
perversion and all of
yeah,
that. And there are perhaps a couple more. I mean, the list is still very small. At least
yes.
the ones that immediately come to mind. But now I have at least a small list of things that look, and unless people ask me directly about them, I basically never mention them to anyone who is not at least familiar with the existence of that movie, for example.
I hear what you're saying. I think probably in my case, um, I I tend to kind of do a preemptive strike, and I will avoid something that I just know I don't want to see. I mean, a good example is, and I'm really not that big a horror fan, but I think my son probably would have enjoyed watching it with me. There's a series called Saw.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
that's like not for me.
I've
That is
watched all
just,
the
I
movies.
know that's not for me. I've never seen a single one of them, so I'm not going to judge, but I know that's not for me. But
Yeah,
what's really interesting to me is, for instance, I'm the movie The Exorcist. I mean, granted, I grew up Catholic, I went to Catholic schools, but the movie The Exorcist was so terrifying to me when I was a kid that I had nightmares about it into adulthood. I mean, well into adulthood. And my 16-year-old daughter, who I think first saw the original Exorcist when she was a really little kid. All three of my kids have seen it. They think it's hilarious. I mean, hilarious. And they think the part where she throws up the pea soup is one of the funniest things they've ever seen. They think the special effects are terrible. I mean, that movie does not give them nightmares
but
even a little bit.
wait a minute. Have they watched the scary movies before watching The Exorcist?
Maybe,
Because if
maybe.
they did, it's easier to understand why they would laugh. Because Scary Movie 2 is all
It's true.
about
That's
is
right with James Woods and yeah. I've seen that exactly. Maybe, but I think also they genuinely think it's a funny movie. I mean, I think they genuinely think it's kind of like like when her head spins around. That was so disturbing to me as a kid to watch that. It was absolutely horrific. And to them, they're like, that is so obviously not real. You know what I mean? And they just think it's funny. And so I'm always intrigued by people who are really into horror in this way, and they don't mind watching people get hacked to death, and they are completely able to separate um, what they're watching with real life, and be like, Mom, It's not real. Don't you get it? It's not real. And whereas to me, I'm watching it and I'm like, I know it's not real, but it feels real. I can see it, and then I'm imagining this in my own life. But not everybody feels that way, and they're able to make that separation. I'm not one of those people. It's why I'm not. I mean, I love a great horror movie. I mean, I think we've talked about this, that the novel Dracula is one of my favorite novels of all time. I think it's
Yep.
so good. Well, I think the character is so good. But I could not be one of those people who loves horror and can watch Saw and The Conjuring and something, some other horrific thing back to back, or like those simulated snuff movies. That, I think that is really horrific to me. The idea, even if it's acted out on film and it's not real, I mean, the idea of snuff that's probably where I would just want to throw up.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Now look, horror movies. It might be weird, but even when it comes to the list of movies that I don't recommend to anyone, not one of them, apart from perhaps The Antichrist, I'm not sure if it's classified as a horror
Yeah.
movie or not, but apart from that one, there's not one single horror movie there. So horror movies, I don't say that I'm a horror movie fan. I've watched a ton of them just
Yeah.
because
Me too.
until a few years ago I was addicted to movies, and so I've
Yeah.
watched everything out there, even
Yeah.
the 1980s slasher movies.
Right.
I've
Right.
watched all
All of
of
it.
them, and most of them do not bother me at all. Some of them make me feel a little bit uneasy, but
Yeah.
not sick nor anything like that. So, but I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm a horror movie fan. But I mean, I guess that the things that perhaps when it comes to recommending them to other people bother me the most, it's when it involves things that can actually happen realistically in real
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Like for example, what happens in the Antichrist that could happen in real life, the sexual perversions in 120 Days of Sodom, and uh, I, I, oh, have you watched Irreversible by Gaspar Noé with Monica Bellucci?
No.
Uh, yeah, so that movie involves a very hard to go through rape scene. I
That
mean,
would be that would be difficult. I
I
mean,
mean,
I would never go so far as to say, that it shouldn't be in a movie or anything like that, but there are definitely things that I would avoid because to me they don't have value, you
and
know?
for example, just a few minutes ago, I mentioned Tony Soprano, and in The Sopranos, there's also a rape scene. I don't know if you remember this, but there's one episode where his female therapist is
Yes,
leaving
I
her
remember that.
office and she's
Yes.
raped by a guy. I can't remember exactly who the guy was, and I think that Tony Soprano eventually gets across that and kills the guy. I can't
I think so.
remember. I can't remember exactly, but uh, I mean, that one, of course, it's always hard to watch those kinds of scenes, always. At least for me personally, it's always because I feel my blood boiling because I get really angry just
Yeah.
imagining something like that happening in front of me, and it really messes me up at least for a few minutes. So, but that one actually, I don't have any problem recommending the entire Sopranos series to anyone, even with that scene and with other stuff. I don't have any problem at all. But Irreversible, I think that they just went too far there. I mean, even I myself, I watched the movie once and I can't watch the movie again, ever again.
I
So,
think probably for me, what would be a line crosser is if a movie was too nihilistic. and cease to have any moral dimension, because I think our lives have a moral dimension, and it's also just deeply disturbing to watch something like that and be able to be able to take any value from that and apply it to my own life, which I think is why I read, and it's why I write, it's why I watch movies. I mean, ultimately, it's why I consume art. It's to be enriched in some way. And if I don't find it enriching, it's funny you should mention The Sopranos, because I too would recommend that series to anyone, but I remember when I stopped watching it. And I may have been pregnant at the time. It's kind of funny because whenever I was pregnant, there were certain things I could not watch, and I could not. I mean, I just couldn't. I mean, I remember in one of my pregnancies, Kill Bill came out. By the way, I love Kill Bill. I watch it now. You know what
awesome.
I mean? I couldn't watch it. I mean, I couldn't. And I remember an episode of The Sopranos, and I have not, from that episode on, I never finished the series. It was a young woman who was a stripper at one of Tony's clubs, and she was pregnant with this awful guy's kid, and he beat her to death. Do you remember the scene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was so disturbing to me, and I knew that guy was eventually going to get it. You know, there was a moral dimension to The Sopranos, actually, you know, but I'm pretty sure I was pregnant when I watched that, because I just couldn't, you know, I just couldn't go beyond that. And not in a judgmental way. I just couldn't watch it because it was so, it was disturbing to me on such a deep level.
Okay, so I
It made me
guess.
physically ill. I mean, I remember it made me physically ill. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps one of the things that bother me when it comes to how certain things are sometimes depicted is if you really need to do it that way or go that far. Because, for example, in The
Yeah.
Sopranos, the rape scene, you see some of it, but
Right.
most of it is suggested, you know?
Yes.
In Irreversible, it's not suggested at all.
I don't think I would like.
It's
Yeah.
all there. And one thing that bothers me about that, it's not just the morality of it, but I wonder whether it's telling me that perhaps the author, the director, the writer, whoever, is not that great at directing or writing. Because for me, someone who's really good at, for example, making someone feeling disgusted at a rape scene does not have to show it all. You
I
know,
agree. I
and
agree. I think
and
it's
I
a
think
different
that
level of disgust.
and I think someone is a better writer if, for example, when it comes to books or I mean, there's that idea of you show, don't tell, right? Show,
Yes.
don't tell. In the case of movies, I would say because it's all showing, you show, but not too much, or you show, but you not describe. I mean, in that case, it's not describing, but it's showing everything down to the details. You know,
I agree with that. I think
and I think that perhaps there are times that's just too much. It's not needed. It's just that's not needed to convey the same kind of or to create the same kind of reaction in viewers or readers.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's funny. I was talking about this with a writer friend. This was some time ago, but when I sat down to write this historical fantasy series, Breath, some years ago when I started it. It has a central love story to it. And at the time, and I think this is largely still the case, really kind of explicit love scenes had made their way into just about every genre. Historical fiction, and it had left the confines of erotica, and it was in science fiction, it was in historical fiction, it was in pretty much every kind of fiction. And I decided that I was not going to do that. I decided that I was going to have a very sensual love story and have it be hopefully very emotional and very compelling, but that I was going to have a fade to black approach. And I'm glad I did that, because I'm for one, I'm really sick of being bombarded by explicit love scenes. At this point, I feel like they're just there. Because, I don't know, maybe the writer feels like they need to put it in there to attract the reader's attention, and that we just keep having to up the ante with these scenes and with these stories, because it's just not enough to have, a passionate kiss, or even regular sort of sex that doesn't involve all sorts of tricks. And after a certain point, it's like, really? I mean, it's sort of like when the James Bond franchise has to scale back, like with the Roger Moore ones when they started going to space and all this stuff. It's like, no. And they've kind of got to bring it back to a place where, look, okay, no, he's just using his fists and his gun. He's not going to be in space. He's not going to be doing any, we're not going to be going to the paranormal. We're not going to make him do things that don't in any way seem realistic for this, now 56-year-old man, for God's sake, with bad knees, probably. So that's something that I've come to feel strongly about. I think that the depiction of sex has just gotten ridiculous.
But
in a lot of stories, and not because I'm prudish about it. I'm not. It's just I'm bored by it, and I feel like we're constantly having to add more whipped cream and more cherries and more chocolate sauce and more peanut sprinkles and then the colorful confetti sprinkles.
Yeah. No, but you know what? When it comes to love scenes, sex scenes, whatever, I mean, I don't have a particular problem in the way they are graphically depicted in more or less detail. I mean, perhaps sometimes I would say, okay, so this is perhaps no longer just a romance novel. This is perhaps already pornography or something like that. But if people are into pornography, fine. I mean, I don't have a moral
problem with it in that regard. I'm not prudish about it. Yeah.
But the thing, for example, about Irreversible and 120 Days of Sodom is that, I mean, in 120 Days of Sodom, I mean, it involves things that I won't even mention here because this will also be on YouTube, and it's just too much. Just to say that it's too much, even for people that watch regular porn, it's just too much.
It goes beyond gratuitous.
Yeah, and then adding hopeless. Yeah, and then adding the rape scene in Irreversible. I mean, sometimes I find myself asking, I mean, isn't this wrong? I mean, and by wrong, I'm not sure if I mean morally wrong or artistically wrong, either because perhaps you shouldn't expose people to so much graphic stuff because it feels sort of wrong, or because as an artist, you don't need to go that far, and so perhaps you're not as great an artist as you think you are or as you could be. And another thing that comes to mind, and that when I really straight out say that it's morally or was morally wrong. For example, back in I want to say 2015, possibly 2016, there was an art exposition in Germany or the Netherlands. I mean, I might be getting the date and the place wrong, but it was definitely in Europe and definitely in the mid 2010. So someone put a dog in an art exposition. He was tied to by a rope, I think, to the wall, and then in front of him, but out of his reach, they put there a plate with food, and the dog couldn't reach the food. And
that would infuriate me.
And the dog died of starvation in an art exposition. And when
God, that is so depraved.
I mean, I didn't see that directly, fortunately, but when I got across that news, I was like, man, whoever did this, I don't care about abstract. I don't care about abstract, well-sounding artistic liberty. That's just plain.
That's cruelty.
Wrong.
That's cruelty.
I mean, you don't do.
You're right. I think
you don't do that to a living being.
No.
Full stop. It just ends there. I don't care about artistic liberty and those well-sounding abstract words. I don't care about that.
Ricardo, I'd never heard of that, and that's disgusting. I don't even understand. I don't think that's an artist. I think that's a sadist who's pretending to be an artist. I think that's a very disturbed person.
No,
because artists understand the difference between their work and, you know what I mean? They understand that it's pretend, and that they're reflecting parts of the world around them and parts of their imagination. But that doesn't make any sense to me. I think that artist was a sadist who was masquerading as an artist. I can't even wrap my head around that.
No, look, there are troubling stuff in artistic creation, but that one, I mean, that went beyond all limits for me. That was just probably the worst thing I ever heard an artist doing.
Yes, I agree. I think I can't think of anything in specific, but I think that there have been times when I've been reading something and I have felt uncomfortable because I feel like the artist is either describing something that they've done or want to do that is abhorrent.
Yeah.
And I can't say what makes me think that it's not just in service of the story. I'm not really sure what it is specifically that made me feel that, except that it's similar to when you just get a bad feeling about a person that you meet and you just think, I don't like that person. There's something about them. And, we just had a very, perfunctory conversation. There's nothing that I can point to specifically, but I don't have a positive feeling about this person.
I mentioned that example specifically because in that example, there's no doubt that the guy who did that is an awful person.
An awful person.
But I mentioned
there's something very, they're sick. That is a sick person.
Yeah, but that's the point I wanted to get at, because sometimes I find myself suspecting if there are particular kinds of creators, artists that uh, include certain things in their stories because they not because they just want to artistically explore this or that or create some sort of emotional reaction, but because they are actually sick in their
I,
heads.
I think, yes, I think for sure. In the same way that I think that there are, people go into certain professions that are honorable professions, but they go into those professions because it allows them under, the guise of either, working with children or being in law enforcement to act out certain fantasies of theirs that are not so healthy. That's something that we always have to be careful of when,
Yeah.
allowing people to be in situations where others are vulnerable.
Yeah, and look, just to be clear, I'm not saying at all, that all artists or the
No,
majority
no, no,
of
not at all.
artists are bad people. I mean, one thing that at least I learned in life, and I haven't seen any evidence that goes against it, is that most people are decent people, and that means that sometimes they
Yeah,
make mistakes,
yeah,
sometimes they do bad things, but most of the time they're just going on with their normal lives. They work, they have their families, they do their things, they try to do as well as they can, fine. And then there are a tiny minority of exceptionally good people, and then there are also there's also a tiny minority of monsters. and and and
I
and
think you're
and
right.
and that's also the tiny minority of artists, possibly, that
Yeah.
I am referring to here. So it's
No,
just that I'm saying.
I think you're quite right. And to me, the evidence for the fact that most people are basically good under most circumstances, particularly if they're well socialized and if they're living within a healthy enough society with appropriate rules and appropriate punishments and incentives.
Yeah.
But if that weren't the case, we'd all be in pretty big trouble. Every time we left our house, it'd be like
Yeah.
there's like the movie The Purge, right? That my kids have seen. Um, so I think you're absolutely right. I think though too that tiny minority can cause a lot of trouble. The tiny minority of monsters. I mean, we can see that on social media. First, I mean, I think that there are a lot of bots on social media. Um,
Right.
and well, that's, I guess, an example of that because here's somebody who's got a bot farm who has, well, the worst intentions and are, dive bombing people's posts and saying absolutely horrible things, anything from just, things that are abhorrent, just morally abhorrent to racist or, whatever it is, just to kind of create the illusion that there are more people who feel that way than there really are, so that maybe they can feel less alone in their depravity. I think that is, part of the way that a platform like Twitter, but it's not just Twitter. I mean, I don't mean to pick on Twitter because I like Twitter. I use Twitter. I use a lot of social media platforms, and I think that they can be a force for a lot of good, but they can also be this weird sort of funhouse mirror. It's funny. I saw this interesting. I passed this interesting post the other day, and I wish I had saved it, but I think I can recall it. But the post basically described how certain social media platforms kind of cater to a certain one of the 7 deadly sins. Instagram is vanity.
Oh, I saw that meme.
Twitter is wrath, right? But LinkedIn is, Facebook is envy. But I thought that was really
Tinder
smart.
is lust.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I thought that was really smart because at their worst, and this is what's so hard. I was talking to another friend of mine. She had, you know, she had built out a lot of the Amazon's advertising console, system. Um, she worked in that, and as a result, she had been to conferences and such where there were people who were dealing with, um, you know, they were. I wouldn't say they were content moderators, but they had some sort of function within these social media companies that
yeah,
had to, monitor bots and all of this. And she was saying how she's like, God, I would not want that job for anything else in the world because it's so hard and you can't even imagine all the crazy stuff that is happening. And, the bot farms and the, people who are purposely, people and entities who are, purposely trying to, um, change a narrative or make us see ourselves or see the world in this sort of funhouse mirror way. And how do you manage that? How do you get rid of the bots while still allowing people to speak
yeah,
and allowing that free flow of ideas to continue? It's very hard.
yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I just brought this discussion to the table about perhaps the morality or immorality of certain art pieces or certain
Yeah.
artists, and perhaps possible deontology for artists or something like that, because I mean, I don't know. Even I myself do not have any definitive answers to these questions,
Me
and
too.
I myself am not so sure. Even when it comes to that list I've mentioned of films I don't recommend
Right.
to anyone, if I should really not recommend them, or I'm still sort of thinking about it, and that's why sometimes I bring that to the table when talking with certain people to see if I can figure out my own thought process. But I mean, it's just questions that I think are worth exploring, because there are perhaps certain things that perhaps we give artists too much leeway, and because they are artists, perhaps there are too many things that we excuse, and perhaps some of them we shouldn't. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I tend to think that when someone goes too far, as the artist with the dog did, that the way that we tend to um, counter that is with a society healthy enough to condemn it and not reward it.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, something that we really need to be careful about in terms of, how we structure our lives, how we structure our cultures and our societies, and understanding um, when bad behaviors cannot be tolerated and must be not just openly discouraged, but really deterred in a way that benefits the whole, right? But not in a way that I, I guess causes a feels unfair and causes a reaction, a counter reaction. But it's hard. I mean, I am not a moral relativist, and I think that the moral relativism that has kind of gripped that we're in the grips of, and that we have been in the grips of for a few decades, is not healthy. I think that we have an obligation to ourselves and to society at large, and certainly to the most vulnerable, to make a decision as to what is morally acceptable behavior and what isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And that if we don't, we put people in danger. Usually people who are most vulnerable, people who are poor, people who are, children who, cannot care for themselves and make decisions for themselves. And that we have to have the strength to stand up for, what is the best thing to do, even if it can be harsh sometimes.
Yeah, no, and another thing that I find interesting here, at least for me, is that I tend to fall much more on the liberal side of the aisle when it comes to politics, economics, and all of that. But when it comes to these particular artistic, moral questions, curiously enough, I guess that all of the things I brought to the table here would be things that you usually associate with conservatives, as them, for example, saying that, oh, you shouldn't depict that kind of thing in art, and I mean that sort of thing. But yeah, it is what it is. So.
Well, we need both. I mean, really, we need without conservatives, people who are more liberal and progressive would take us off a cliff. And without liberals and progressives, conservatives wouldn't allow our society to grow because too cautious. We need both to work together. And I don't think it would be healthy to be someone who only has a progressive mindset or only has a conservative mindset. I think that part of this culture war that we're having is the result of these two extremes, which often sound very similar to one another, having arguments over the vast majority of people who tend to pick and choose their viewpoints, I guess, a little more bipartisanly. Let's put it that way. You know what I mean? And you can be a very liberal person and yet think, okay, I think that there are moral limits to what, say, a performance artist, like the artist you mentioned, should be able to do. That no one should be able to come to harm, or no creature, no sentient creature, like a dog, you should be able to come to harm because in the name of, quote, art, right? I think that is reasonable to have that point of view. And just as it's reasonable to be, a conservative person and say, I just, don't have a problem with finding a compromise on even an incredibly contentious societal issue like abortion or marriage rights or whatever it is that might be theirs, and I think most people are willing to make compromises in between, and most people understand that there are pros and cons to most issues, and that we have to weigh those as a society. And if we're not weighing them, and we're only kind of marching lockstep with whatever side we believe ourselves to be on, that doesn't really feel like progress either, and that doesn't feel like it will lead to a graceful and functioning society.
Well, actually, now that I think about it, and referring to that example with the dog, I think I don't know exactly when that started, but don't you see now in many times in movies, before the movie starts, when they evolve animals, a message there, something like no animals were hurt,
yeah.
in the filming
Yeah.
of this movie or something like that. So at least that's something that people care more about and think that goes beyond artistic expression, I guess.
Yeah, I think most people are horrified by that. I mean, really, I mean, isn't that the one of the signs of a future serial killer, someone who tortures animals as a kid?
Yeah.
You know, I think that is a pretty serious taboo, and rightly so, uh, of, for one's own gratification to be hurting another being. You know, that's something that even with like talking about 50 Shades of Grey, there's a reason why in those communities there are all sorts of strictures that are put into place so that you never go too far
Yeah.
because of how dangerous it is um, when we do go too far.
Yeah.
It is
So,
dangerous, you know? I think
yeah, it
that,
is.
yeah,
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon and PayPal. The links are in the description down below. And also please share, like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Perga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Frederick Sunde, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormer, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sadus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Anik Punta, Radana Rosmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Alec Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Morey, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Herringbone, Starry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Paul Crowleys, Kate Von Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hurtner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, and David Pinsoff. A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stefaniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, Nick Golden, and Rosie, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivet. Thank you for all.